Here we have the board of endocrine glands, just a few to be specific. I'd like to start here with the pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis, made up of the adenohypophysis, or anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and the neurohypophysis, or posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, inherently controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones derived from and secreted by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland are joined by the structure known as an infundibulum or infundibular stalk. I do want you to know of two very important hormones released by the neurohypophysis, but actually made up here in the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, known as oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Although stored and released from the neurohypophysis, they're actually made up here in the hypothalamus. Anteriorly, we find the adenohypophysis, responsible for the production and secretion of 6 major tropic hormones. Tropic or tropin means to nourish or to grow. Derived from this anterior pituitary gland, we're going to have things like the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, whose targets are specialized cells within the gonads. We also have human growth hormone that gets transformed in the liver to somatostatin and has a final target of skeletal system, the bones, and skeletal muscle. ACTH, derived from the adenohypophysis, adenocorticotropic hormone, causes growth of the adrenal cortex. Also production and secretion of cortical hormones such as mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. As we go deeper through the 3 zones, we'll see that more in lecture. We also have thyroid stimulating hormone, responsible for stimulating, what do you know? The thyroid, causing its activation and production of such things as T3 triiodothyronine and T4 tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine, both of which will affect basal metabolic rate. Also coming from this adenohypophysis is the hormone prolactin. Activates the mammary glands to produce and secrete breast milk. That, when combined with oxytocin derived from the posterior pituitary, leads to actual ejection or letdown followed by ejection of breast milk. I think maybe I got all 6 there. If I come across another one, I'll talk about it. I did talk about the T3 and T4 coming from the thyroid. I also want to talk a little bit about calcitonin coming from the thyroid. When blood calcium levels are found to be too high or elevated, the thyroid's going to release calcitonin in an attempt to lower blood calcium levels by decreasing their absorption in the intestine. We want to lower those blood calcium levels by putting some of that calcium ions into our savings account, our skeletal system, as well as excreting them through the kidneys and the digestive system. Flipping this thyroid gland around, we find the superior and inferior parathyroid glands that will, in response to low blood calcium levels, produce and secrete parathyroid hormone, which activates specialized cells like osteoclasts to break down bone matrix material, releasing those calcium ions into the blood, therefore increasing overall blood calcium levels. Coming over here, we find the pancreas. Mostly an exocrine gland, meaning it produces and secretes its products into ducts, such as those used to aid in digestion. About 1% of the pancreas is in fact endocrine tissue. We find these endocrine glands located in tiny aggregates known as islets of Langerhans. The only two cell types located in those islets of Langerhans, I absolutely have to have you know, are going to be the alpha cells and the beta cells. The alpha cells, in response to low blood glucose levels, will produce and secrete glucagon when your glucose is gone. So that stored glucose in the skeletal muscle in the form of glycogen, found throughout the body's adipocytes in the form of fat or adipose, can be mobilized, broken down, and released back into the bloodstream, picking up blood glucose levels. When blood glucose levels are too high, beta cells located in the islets of Langerhans within the pancreas will produce and secrete insulin directly into the bloodstream, right? That's what an endocrine gland does. Secretes its products directly into the bloodstream. And insulin allows glucose molecules to gain access, to be transported across the plasma membrane of cells where it can be torn in half through the process of glycolysis in order to extract some energy. I had talked about the ACTH from here acting upon the adrenal cortex, the outside of the adrenal gland, to produce glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and androgens. But also in the inner medulla, we have epinephrine and norepinephrine being produced and secreted as hormones in the endocrine, causing physiological changes elsewhere in the body on the cellular level. We're going to wrap up this endocrine board with the gonads in the male and female, the testes and ovaries respectively. Here in the testes, in response to luteinizing hormone derived from the adenohypophysis, specialized cells within the lobules, in between the seminiferous tubules, these interstitial cells, also known as Leydig cells, will produce and secrete testosterone into the bloodstream in response to presence of luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone leads to the process of spermatogenesis, the creation of new sperm within the coiled-up tubes, those seminiferous tubules in these lobules of the testes. Down here, the ovary is another really important storage facility for gametes, unfertilized eggs, as well as a hormone production factory. In response to FSH, derived from the adenohypophysis, these egg nests and primordial follicles will go on to become things like primary follicles, secondary follicles, and eventually tertiary follicles. The difference between a primary and a secondary follicle is the appearance of this fluid-filled antrum. Finally, a very mature tertiary, also known as Graafian follicle, experiences a huge LH surge from the adenohypophysis about 13 days post-onset of menses. This huge luteinizing hormone surge causes ovulation of this oocyte that gets captured by the finger-like projection fimbriae found at the distal portion of the fallopian tube. This unfertilized egg moves through different portions such as the antrum or infundibulum up into the antrum, where it meets a sperm up here. This is where fertilization takes place. Travels down to the isthmus and hopefully implants into the lining of the uterus. We'll talk about that during reproductive. So that's that board.